They called her the praying woman, as if faith were something to be pitied rather than admired. But Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore carried within her heart a light that no amount of mockery could extinguish. The morning air in Redemption Falls carried the scent of sage and dust, mingling with the faint sound of hammers against wood as the town slowly awakened. Sarah stood at the window of the boarding house, her calloused hands folded in prayer, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Her traveling dress, though worn and patched, was clean and pressed, and around her neck hung a simple wooden cross, carved by her father's hands before consumption claimed his life. The letter from Daniel Morrison lay folded in her reticule, his words practical and honest. He needed a wife to help with his ranch and 2 young children left motherless by fever. He made no promises of love, only of respect and partnership. Sarah had prayed long over that letter, and in the silence of her heart, she had felt the gentle nudging of Providence guiding her westward. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. The stagecoach had deposited her in Redemption Falls 3 days ago, and already she could sense the spiritual drought that gripped this place. The saloon doors swung wide with laughter and profanity, while the small church at the end of Main Street stood empty except for Sunday mornings, and even then, only a handful of souls ventured through its doors. The townspeople looked at her with curiosity tinged with suspicion, their eyes lingering on the cross at her throat and the worn Bible tucked under her arm. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper, had clucked her tongue disapprovingly when Sarah knelt beside her bed for evening prayers. The woman had seen mail-order brides before, she said, and they usually came seeking fortune or escape, not carrying on conversations with the Almighty. But Sarah's quiet grace and gentle manner had begun to soften even Mrs. Henderson's cynical heart. Daniel Morrison was expected today, and Sarah felt her stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. She had committed her future to a man she knew only through letters, trusting that God would honor her faithfulness and guide their union toward his purposes. The morning light shifted through the boarding house window, casting shadows that danced across the rough wooden floor, and Sarah breathed a prayer for wisdom and strength. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention back to the dusty street below. A tall man on a chestnut horse rode slowly down Main Street, his eyes scanning the storefronts with the careful attention of someone searching for something specific. His broad shoulders filled out a clean work shirt, and his weathered hat shadowed a face marked by both sorrow and determination. This had to be Daniel Morrison. Sarah's heart quickened as she watched him dismount and tie his horse to the hitching post outside the boarding house. His movements were deliberate and economical, the actions of a man accustomed to hard work and responsibility. She could see the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders, the grief that lingered around his eyes even at this distance. The Lord had not led her to an easy situation, but then, the most meaningful work rarely was. The sound of his boots on the wooden steps echoed through the boarding house, followed by Mrs. Henderson's voice calling up the stairs. "Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, your gentleman caller has arrived." Sarah smoothed her skirts, touched the cross at her throat for comfort, and descended to meet the man who might become her husband. Daniel Morrison stood in the small parlor, his hat in his hands, studying her with eyes the color of stormy skies. He was older than she had imagined, perhaps 40, with threads of silver beginning to show at his temples. Lines of worry and work mapped his face, but she could see kindness in his expression and something else that made her heart stir with compassion. This was a man who had loved deeply and lost much. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice deep and carefully controlled. "I appreciate you making the journey. I know it wasn't easy." Sarah smiled, her faith steadying her nerves. "The Lord has been gracious in bringing me safely here, Mr. Morrison. I trust he has purposes in this meeting that we cannot yet see." Something shifted in Daniel's expression at her words, a flicker of surprise followed by what might have been wariness. He had mentioned in his letters that his late wife had been a woman of faith, but he had not spoken of his own relationship with spiritual matters. Sarah sensed immediately that this was tender ground, a place where old wounds still ached. They spoke quietly in the parlor, with Mrs. Henderson hovering nearby under the pretense of dusting already clean surfaces. Daniel's conversation was practical, discussing the ranch, his children, and the expectations of frontier life. But Sarah listened with more than her ears, hearing the careful way he avoided any mention of hope or healing, the way his voice grew distant when he spoke of his late wife. "The children need stability," he said, staring at his hands. "Mary is 8 and Thomas is 6. They've grown wild since their mother passed. The ranch is prosperous enough, but it takes all my time and energy. I need a partner, someone who can bring order to the household and help raise them properly." Sarah nodded, understanding that he was offering her a business arrangement more than a marriage. But she also sensed the deep loneliness that drove his practical words, the hunger for companionship that he was afraid to acknowledge. The Lord, she realized, had brought her here for reasons that went far beyond housekeeping and child-rearing. "I would be honored to meet your children, Mr. Morrison," she said gently. "And I want you to know that I take the responsibility of caring for them as seriously as any mother would her own." Daniel's eyes met hers then, and she saw a flicker of something vulnerable and grateful. "Good," he said simply. "We can ride out to the ranch this afternoon, if you're agreeable. You can see what you'd be taking on." The ride to the Morrison Ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Sarah had ever seen. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains, their slopes painted with wildflowers and dotted with cattle. The air was clean and sharp, filled with the songs of meadowlarks and the whisper of grass in the wind. Sarah found herself praising God silently for the beauty of his creation, her heart lifting despite the uncertainty of her situation. Daniel rode beside her in comfortable silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or explaining aspects of ranch life. She could see him relaxing slightly away from town, his shoulders losing some of their rigid tension as they moved through the landscape he clearly loved. This was his domain, the place where he felt most capable and confident. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small rise, a sturdy log structure with a wide porch and flower boxes that had been lovingly tended but now showed signs of neglect. Sarah could envision what it had been when a woman's touch had made it a true home, and she felt a pang of sympathy for the man beside her who had lost so much. 2 children burst from the house as they approached, their clothes rumpled and their faces streaked with dirt. The girl had her father's storm-gray eyes and hair the color of wheat, while the boy was darker, with a stubborn set to his jaw that spoke of a strong will. They stopped short when they saw Sarah, suddenly shy and uncertain. "Mary, Thomas," Daniel called as he dismounted. "Come meet Miss Whitmore." The children approached cautiously, like young animals unsure whether to flee or investigate. Sarah remained seated on her horse, allowing them to study her without feeling pressured. She had learned patience working with the children at the orphanage back east, understanding that trust could not be rushed. "Are you going to be our new mama?" the little girl asked bluntly, her chin raised in a gesture that reminded Sarah strongly of Daniel. "I hope we can become good friends," Sarah replied gently. "And perhaps, if your father and I decide we suit each other, something more than that in time." The boy, Thomas, scowled and kicked at the dirt. "We don't need a new mama," he announced. "We do fine by ourselves." Sarah saw Daniel's jaw tighten, but she held up a hand to forestall his correction. "Of course you do fine," she said calmly. "You're strong, capable children. But sometimes it's nice to have help, even when we don't strictly need it. Like when neighbors help each other during harvest time, or when friends share a meal." Thomas considered this, his scowl softening slightly. Mary stepped closer, curiosity winning over caution. "Do you know how to braid hair?" she asked. "Mine gets all tangled, and Papa tries, but his fingers are too big." Sarah smiled, her heart warming toward this earnest little girl. "I do know how to braid hair," she said, "and how to make it shine like gold when it's clean." The tour of the ranch house revealed both its potential and its current state of benign neglect. The rooms were spacious and well-built, but they lacked the touches that made a house a home. Dust gathered in corners, dishes were stacked haphazardly in the kitchen, and the children's rooms showed clear evidence of absent supervision. But Sarah could also see the love that had once filled these spaces. Hand-sewn curtains, though now faded, hung at the windows. A rocking chair sat by the fireplace, its wood worn smooth by countless hours of use. A small garden plot behind the house struggled to produce vegetables without proper tending. This was a home waiting to be restored, a family waiting to be healed. Sarah felt the familiar stirring in her spirit that she had learned to recognize as divine calling. The Lord had not brought her here merely to marry Daniel Morrison. He had brought her here to be an instrument of healing and restoration. That evening, as Sarah prepared to return to town with Daniel, young Mary approached her with shy determination. "Miss Whitmore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "will you pray with me tonight? Mama used to pray with me every night, but Papa doesn't know the words anymore." Sarah's heart clenched with compassion for this motherless child and for the father who had lost his way in grief. "Of course, sweet girl," she said, kneeling to Mary's level. "Prayer is one of the most important things we can do together." As they knelt beside Mary's small bed, Sarah began to speak to the Lord with the natural familiarity of old friendship. She thanked him for the beauty of the day, for safe travels, and for the blessing of meeting Mary and Thomas. She asked for wisdom and guidance, for healing where there had been hurt, and for love to grow where fear had taken root. Mary's small voice joined hers, hesitant at first but growing stronger as the words came back to her. In the doorway, Sarah was aware of Daniel standing in the shadows, listening. She did not acknowledge his presence, understanding instinctively that he needed to observe this moment without feeling exposed or obligated to participate. When they finished, Mary threw her arms around Sarah's neck with impulsive affection. "I'm glad you came," she whispered. "I asked God to send us someone who remembered how to talk to him." The ride back to town passed in thoughtful silence. Daniel seemed lost in reflection, occasionally glancing at Sarah as if trying to solve a puzzle she presented. Finally, as they approached the boarding house, he spoke. "The children have taken to you quickly," he observed. "They're wonderful children," Sarah replied. "They just need to know they're safe and loved." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "My late wife, Elizabeth, she was a woman of faith, like you. After she died, I found it hard to—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Faith can feel like a luxury when we're drowning in grief," Sarah said gently. "But it's actually when we need it most, even when we can't feel it." They had reached the boarding house, and Daniel dismounted to help her down from her horse. His hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than necessary, and Sarah felt the connection between them, tentative but real. "I'd like you to come back tomorrow," he said. "Stay for a few days, see how you take to ranch life. The children would like it, and—" He paused, then met her eyes directly. I think I would too. That night, Sarah knelt beside her narrow bed in the boarding house and poured out her heart to the Lord. She prayed for Daniel's wounded spirit, for the children who had lost their anchor, and for her own heart as it began to open to possibilities she had not dared imagine. The path ahead was uncertain, but she felt the peace that came from walking in alignment with divine will. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of spring warmth in the air. Sarah packed her few belongings and prepared to spend several days at the Morrison Ranch, understanding that this time would determine the direction of all their lives. Daniel arrived promptly, and Sarah noticed that he had taken extra care with his appearance. His shirt was freshly pressed, his boots polished, and his hair neatly combed. The gesture touched her more than elaborate courtship might have, because she recognized it as his way of showing respect for the seriousness of their arrangement. The children greeted her arrival with barely contained excitement. Mary had attempted to braid her own hair with mixed results, and Thomas had actually washed his face without being asked. Sarah felt a surge of tenderness for these little ones who were trying so hard to make a good impression. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt natural and right. Sarah rose early to prepare breakfast, her movements efficient but unhurried in the spacious kitchen. She taught Mary how to properly set the table and showed Thomas how to gather eggs without frightening the chickens. The children responded to her gentle guidance with eagerness, hungry for the structure and attention they had been missing. Daniel watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that he was not yet ready to name. Sarah brought a sense of peace to his home that he had forgotten was possible. Her quiet prayers before meals, offered without fanfare or expectation, gradually became a comfort rather than a reminder of loss. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, Daniel and Sarah would sit on the front porch, talking about the day's events and sharing pieces of their histories. Sarah spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her work at the orphanage, and her decision to answer his advertisement. Daniel, more gradually, began to share memories of building the ranch, his dreams for his children's futures, and carefully edited recollections of his life with Elizabeth. It was during one of these quiet conversations that Daniel first spoke directly about his struggle with faith. Elizabeth believed so strongly, he said, staring out at the star-filled sky. She was convinced that God had a plan for everything, that even suffering served some greater purpose. When she died, I felt like either she was wrong or God had abandoned us. Sarah listened without judgment, understanding that he was sharing something deeply personal. Sometimes, she said softly, we mistake God's silence for absence. But maybe he's not silent. Maybe we're just too hurt to hear him. Daniel turned to look at her then, his expression vulnerable in the lamplight. How do you keep believing when everything falls apart? Sarah considered her answer carefully. I don't think faith means never questioning or never feeling angry. I think it means choosing to trust that love is stronger than loss, that hope is more powerful than despair. Not because it's easy, but because the alternative is too empty to bear. These conversations were building something between them, a foundation of trust and understanding that went deeper than the practical arrangement they had initially discussed. Sarah could feel Daniel's walls slowly crumbling, and she prayed daily for wisdom in helping him find his way back to hope. The turning point came on a Sunday morning when Mary asked if they could attend church as a family. Sarah had been wanting to visit the small church in town, but she had not wanted to pressure Daniel or make assumptions about his comfort level. Papa used to take us to church, Mary said earnestly, before Mama got sick. I miss singing the songs. Daniel's expression tightened, and Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Finally, he nodded stiffly. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to make an appearance, he said. The small church was nearly empty when they arrived, with only a handful of dedicated worshippers scattered among the ruffian pews. The pastor, a young man named Reverend Matthews, greeted them warmly and seemed particularly pleased to see Daniel after what had clearly been a long absence. The service was simple and heartfelt, with singing that filled the small space with joy despite the sparse congregation. Sarah felt her soul lifting as her voice joined with the others, and she noticed Mary singing with enthusiasm beside her. Thomas fidgeted but remained reasonably quiet, and Daniel sat stiffly, his face carefully neutral. But during the pastor's sermon about the shepherd who left the 99 sheep to search for the one that was lost, Sarah saw something shift in Daniel's expression. The young pastor spoke about God's persistent love, about how the shepherd never gave up searching because every single sheep mattered to him. After the service, several church members approached to welcome Sarah and express their happiness at seeing the Morrison family again. Their genuine warmth and concern for Daniel and the children spoke to a community that had been praying for this family's healing, even when Daniel had distanced himself from their fellowship. On the ride home, Mary chattered excitedly about seeing her friends and hearing familiar hymns. Thomas was quieter but seemed thoughtful rather than resistant. Daniel remained silent, but Sarah sensed that something important had happened in his heart during that simple service. That afternoon, as Sarah helped Mary with her letters and Thomas practiced his numbers, Daniel approached her with an unusual request. Would you read to us tonight? He asked. From your Bible, I mean. It's been a long time since there were Bible stories in this house. Sarah's heart soared with quiet joy. Of course, she said simply, understanding that this was a significant step for him. That evening, they gathered in the parlor as Sarah read the story of the prodigal son, her voice gentle and clear in the lamplight. The children listened with rapt attention, and Sarah was acutely aware of Daniel's focused presence, as if he were hearing these familiar words with new ears. When she finished, Thomas asked why the father was so happy to see the son who had been bad. Before Sarah could answer, Daniel spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Because love doesn't stop, even when we make mistakes or go away. The father never stopped watching for his son to come home. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning that went beyond the story itself. Sarah met Daniel's eyes and saw tears threatening to spill over. In that moment, she understood that he was talking about more than the parable. He was beginning to understand that his own journey away from faith didn't mean that God's love had abandoned him. As the days turned into weeks, the changes in the Morrison household became increasingly evident. The children bloomed under Sarah's consistent love and guidance, their wild energy channeled into helpful tasks and creative play. Mary's hair was always neatly braided now, and she had learned to help with cooking and mending. Thomas still tested boundaries, but he had accepted Sarah's authority and even seemed to seek her approval. Daniel was changing too, though more slowly and with greater internal struggle. He began joining in their evening prayers, at first silently but gradually adding his own words of gratitude and petition. He started attending church regularly, no longer sitting stiffly but actually participating in the singing and responding to the pastor's messages with evident thought. The transformation was not without setbacks. There were days when grief would ambush Daniel unexpectedly, leaving him withdrawn and defensive. During one particularly difficult evening, triggered by finding one of Elizabeth's old letters, he lashed out at Sarah, accusing her of trying to replace his wife and manipulate his faith. Sarah absorbed his anger without retaliation, understanding that healing was rarely a straight path. After he stormed out of the house, she gathered the confused and frightened children and led them in prayer for their father's hurting heart. When Daniel returned hours later, ashamed and apologetic, he found them still praying in the parlor. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice broken. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to move forward without feeling like I'm betraying her memory." Sarah rose and went to him, taking his hands in hers. "Elizabeth wouldn't want you to stop living," she said gently. "She would want you and the children to find joy again. Loving again doesn't diminish what you had with her. It honors it by showing that you learned how to love well." It was in that moment of vulnerability and grace that Daniel finally allowed himself to admit what had been growing between them. "I love you, Sarah," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I never thought I could love anyone else, but I do. And that terrifies me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she cupped his face in her hands. "I love you too, Daniel. And I'm not afraid, because I know that God brought us together for healing, for wholeness, for a future filled with hope." Their wedding took place 6 weeks later in the little church that had become central to their restored faith. The entire community turned out to celebrate, understanding that this union represented more than just a marriage between two individuals. It was a testament to the power of faith to heal broken hearts and create new beginnings from the ashes of loss. Sarah wore Elizabeth's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, at Daniel's request and with his late wife's family's blessing. The gesture might have seemed strange to outsiders, but for Daniel and Sarah, it represented continuity rather than replacement, honor rather than erasure. Mary served as flower girl, her face glowing with happiness as she scattered rose petals from Elizabeth's restored garden. Thomas carried the rings with solemn dignity, proud of his important role in creating their new family structure. As they exchanged vows, Daniel's voice was strong and sure. "Before God and this community, I promise to love and cherish you, to build a life of faith and service together, and to trust in His plan for our future." Sarah's response was equally firm. "I promise to love your children as my own, to be a partner in all things, and to help you continue growing in faith and love each day the Lord gives us together." The reception was held in the church hall, with food contributed by every family in the community. Children ran and played while adults shared stories and offered advice to the newlyweds. It was exactly the kind of celebration Sarah had always dreamed of, surrounded by people who had become family through shared faith and mutual support. As the evening wound down, Daniel and Sarah prepared to return to the ranch with their children. The little church was nearly empty now, lit only by a few oil lamps that cast long shadows across the simple altar where they had been married. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly to Sarah as they gathered their things, "for never giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself." Sarah smiled, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Faith isn't about never falling down," she replied. "It's about always getting back up and helping others do the same." The months that followed brought the deep satisfaction of a life lived in alignment with divine purpose. Sarah threw herself into making the ranch house a true home, not by erasing Elizabeth's memory, but by building upon the foundation of love she had established. She taught Mary to cook her mother's favorite recipes and helped Thomas understand that honoring his mother's memory meant living with the kindness and courage she had modeled. Daniel's spiritual journey continued to deepen as he allowed himself to trust again in God's goodness. He began reading scripture daily, not from duty, but from hunger for the peace and guidance he found there. His prayers became conversations rather than recitations, and he started leading family devotions with confidence and genuine joy. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, but more importantly, it became known throughout the territory as a place of hospitality and help. Travelers were always welcome at their table, and struggling families knew they could find both practical assistance and spiritual encouragement from the Morrisons. Sarah established a small school in town, teaching children who had been going without education due to the lack of resources. Daniel served as a deacon in the church, helping Reverend Matthews minister to the growing congregation. Together, they became pillars of the community, not through wealth or status but through their willingness to serve others. Their own family grew with the addition of 2 more children, a daughter they named Faith and a son called Samuel. Mary and Thomas embraced their roles as big siblings with enthusiasm, helping to care for the babies and teaching them about their blended family's history and values. As Sarah rocked little Faith to sleep one evening, with Samuel playing at her feet and the older children doing their lessons at the kitchen table, she marveled at the intricate way God had woven their lives together. What had begun as a practical arrangement had become a love story that encompassed not just a man and woman, but an entire community touched by the transformative power of lived faith. Daniel joined her in the nursery, sliding his arms around her from behind as they watched their daughter sleep. "She looks like you," he murmured against Sarah's hair. "But she has Elizabeth's stubborn chin." Sarah leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid strength of the man who had learned to love again. "She'll need that stubbornness," she said softly. "Strong women always do." As night settled over the ranch, the family gathered for their evening prayers as had become their cherished tradition. For children of varying ages knelt beside their parents, their voices joining in gratitude for the day's blessings and petitions for guidance and protection. Sarah's faith had indeed changed her life, but perhaps more importantly, it had changed the lives of everyone she touched. In a frontier community where survival often depended on individual strength and self-reliance, she had demonstrated the power of surrendering to a love greater than themselves, of trusting in purposes beyond their immediate understanding. The little cross at her throat caught the lamplight as she tucked the children into their beds, the same simple wooden cross her father had carved so many years ago. It had traveled with her across the country, a tangible reminder of the faith that had sustained her through uncertainty and guided her toward love. Years later, when visitors to Redemption Falls remarked on the strong faith community that thrived there, longtime residents would tell them about the mail-order bride whose quiet faith had changed everything. She had arrived as a stranger seeking a new life, but her trust in divine love had transformed an entire town, proving that faith lived authentically has the power to heal, restore, and create hope where none existed before. We hope Sarah's story of faith and transformation has touched your heart today. If you found strength in your own faith journey, or if this story has encouraged you to explore what it means to trust in something greater than yourself, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.